The dawn rose pale over the town of Dry Creek, its light creeping across the rooftops, as though reluctant to touch a place so heavy with silence. Dust drifted across the single street like ghosts stirred from slumber, and shutters creaked as watchful eyes opened to the day. On that morning Marian Harper stepped barefoot across the dirt road, the hem of her faded dress torn and frayed, the weight of her scars hidden beneath the fabric, yet spoken of in whispers from every porch. She had been whipped 100 times by a man who called himself her husband, each lash a mark carved into her flesh and memory, each scar a reminder that cruelty could live long in the bones of a woman. The townsfolk knew it, and though some pitied her, most turned their heads, for pity was dangerous in a place where survival demanded hardness. She carried herself with a quiet dignity, her shoulders drawn but not broken, her chin lowered yet unbowed. Children paused their play to stare, then whispered among themselves as though speaking of a ghost. Marianne passed them without pause, her eyes set on the mercantile ahead, her bare feet stirring dust that clung to her ankles. She was 29 years of age, though life had pressed her into years beyond her count. Her eyes were gray as winter clouds, her hair a tangle of dark strands pulled into a knot. She walked like one who had grown accustomed to carrying weight unseen. Inside the mercantile, Samuel Briggs waited, his figure tall and broad, his clothes clean and pressed, as though he sought to carry the air of refinement in a town where dust spared no man. He was 35, a settler who had prospered from land deals and cattle, a man who smiled with the thinness of a blade. Once, he had spoken to Marianne with promises of safety, the kind of words that drew hope into her weary chest. But promises are light things, and Samuel's words had proven lighter still. She entered the store quietly, the air thick with the scent of flour and tobacco. The moment her shadow crossed the threshold, Samuel's voice rose, loud enough for every ear to catch. "I told you before, Marianne, no man wants a woman so ruined. 100 lashes on your back. There's nothing left to call pure. You should know better than to think a man like me would bind himself to you." The room grew still. Clara Mayfield, a widow in her 40s with a heart kinder than most dared to show, clutched her basket tighter and looked to the floor. Sheriff Owen Tate, standing near the counter, shifted uneasily, his weathered face betraying the discomfort of a man who recognized cruelty, yet held no words to still it. The shopkeeper busied himself with jars, pretending not to hear. Silence pressed in, broken only by Samuel's sharp voice. "I won't have it said I took a scarred woman for a wife. Better you learn now than carry on with foolish hopes. My fortune demands respectability, and you," he gestured with disdain, "bring only shame." Marian did not cry, though the words struck harder than any whip. She steadied herself, her fingers tightening around the threadbare shawl draped across her shoulders. Her lips parted, but no defense rose to her tongue. Instead, she turned, her face pale yet calm, and stepped back into the sunlight. The town breathed with her silence, whispers trailing her path like nettles brushing skin. Outside, the dust swirled about her feet, the wind catching strands of her hair and lifting them across her face. She walked the length of the street, eyes fixed ahead, though she felt the weight of every gaze upon her. Pride and shame warred within her, but she carried neither to her lips. Her dignity was in her silence, in the way her back, scarred though it was, remained straight beneath the cloth. Among the townsfolk gathered, one pair of eyes watched with a different weight. Elias Boone stood near the hitching post, his hands buried in the pockets of his worn coat, the brim of his hat casting a shadow across his face. He was 38, a rancher who lived miles beyond town, where the prairie stretched wide and lonely. His days were filled with cattle, the creak of wind through fences, and the silence of a man who had chosen solitude over false company. He had no wife, no kin nearby, only the land and his quiet labor. Yet in the stillness of his gaze, there was no judgment, only a recognition that carried deeper than the murmurs around him. He saw her walk, saw the dignity she held though the world sought to strip it, and something in him tightened, not pity, not desire, but a respect born of understanding. He did not step forward then. Elias Boone was not a man to intrude upon another's moment of pain. But the image of her walking through the dust, unbroken despite the weight of 100 lashes and the sting of public rejection, carved itself into his memory. That night, the town settled into its quiet rhythm, lamps glowing in windows, the sound of laughter spilling from a saloon. Mary Ann sat alone in the small room she rented above the seamstress's shop, her hands folded in her lap, her back aching as it always did when night fell and the air cooled. She replayed the words of Samuel Briggs in her mind, each syllable a reminder that society would always measure her worth by the scars she carried. Yet she did not weep. Tears had been beaten from her long ago. What remained was a hollow resilience, the kind that endured because it had no choice. Meanwhile, Elias tended his cattle beneath a sky swept with stars, the prairie wind carrying the faint cry of a coyote. He thought of a woman in town, thought of the strength in her silence. He had known loneliness all his years, but in that memory he recognized a loneliness deeper than his own. And though he did not yet act, a seed had been planted. The days passed. Samuel Briggs went about his business, boasting of his fortune, speaking loud in the saloon of how he had cast aside the scarred woman. Men laughed, though uneasily, for cruelty left a bitter taste even when dressed in pride. Women shook their heads, whispering of the shame he had brought not upon her, but upon himself. Yet Mary Ann carried on. She fetched water from the well, mended clothes for coin, and walked with the same quiet dignity that unsettled those who sought to break her. It was a week later when she struggled with a sack of flour outside the mercantile, her hands trembling under its weight. The burlap slipped, dust spilling onto her dress. Before she could fall beneath it, another hand caught the other end, lifting with steady ease. She looked up, startled, into the face of Elias Boone. His eyes were the color of worn leather, steady and calm, his jaw rough with days of stubble. He said nothing, only hefted the sack with her and carried it into the store. She whispered a thank you, her voice soft as wind through grass. He tipped his hat in quiet acknowledgment and left without another word. Yet that moment lingered in her chest longer than Samuel's cruel speech. For the first time in years, she had been helped without pity, touched without harm. Elias found himself returning to town more often. He had no need for flour or nails, yet he rode in, tipping his hat to townsfolk, his eyes searching for Mary Ann. He did not speak much, but when their paths crossed, he offered small gestures, lifting a bucket, offering her a seat on his wagon when she walked miles under the sun. She never asked why, and he never explained. Their bond grew not through words, but through the silence between them, a silence that felt less empty and more like shelter. Still, Samuel Briggs did not fade. He carried resentment, his pride wounded that the woman he had cast aside now found a measure of respect he could not command. One afternoon he confronted her again on the street, his voice sharp. "You think you're better than me, walking with your head high? Don't forget what you are. Don't forget those scars." He raised his hand as though to strike, the echo of old cruelty alive once more. But before the blow could fall, Elias Boone stepped forward. His hand caught Samuel's wrist in a grip firm as iron. His voice was low, steady as the ground beneath their boots. "She belongs to no man, and she will not be harmed again." The street fell silent, the townsfolk watching, the dust swirling like storm clouds around them. Samuel's face twisted, but the strength in Elias's grip forced his hand to fall. Sheriff Tate stepped forward then, his voice firm. "That's enough, Briggs. You've had your say. Leave her be, or leave this town." Samuel spat on the ground, pride wounded beyond repair, and stalked away. The crowd slowly dispersed, murmurs following, but Mary Ann stood still, her eyes wide not with fear, but with something deeper, astonishment that someone had stood between her and the whip, that someone had spoken not of ownership, but of protection. Elias released Samuel's wrist and turned to her, his gaze steady. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head, unable to find words. He tipped his hat, the gesture simple, then walked away, leaving her heart beating with a rhythm she had long forgotten. That night, alone in her room, Mary Ann pressed her hands to her chest and felt the echo of those words. She belongs to no man. They were the first words in years that had given her a taste of freedom, a glimpse of what life might be if lived without fear. And those scars still ached across her back. For the first time she believed perhaps healing did not come from forgetting the lashes, but from finding someone who would never raise the whip.